Warning, particle cannon activated. Unit lost.
It's easy after doing this for so many years I've been doing, looking at alphas, looking at every single spec in the game, to become jaded and to lose your passion for it and to see things as all being kind of a blur and very samey. At the beginning of Legion, I absolutely felt that way. A lot of the specs felt really mundane, really boring. It seems like Blizzard was taking away a lot of the stuff that made the specs unique and interesting and fun. Almost a homogenization across the board. Build a resource, spend a resource. And I felt like maybe I was doing a disservice to you guys, and your feedback was always the same. It was like, nah, maybe you've been doing this too long. And I was questioning myself whether that was the case. Unfortunately, I then encountered the Shadow Priest, the Warlock, all three specs, including Destruction, which is coming up this week, so watch for that one, and the Guardian Druid, which made me remember I still love this game. I still love these specs, and Blizzard is fully capable of giving us wonderful things. In playing the Moonkin, which I've been playing on and off a lot of since November, I always felt like a lot of the changes were cop-outs. The resource system was something we've seen before. The spender system wasn't exciting. And I was looking at the talent system thinking, it's kind of okay, and nothing about it inspired me. And I got to think, how has this happened to a spec which gave me such wonderful memories? I went back and looked at my Warlords of Draenor footage. You can click the video up there and see how much joy it brought me to play the Moonkin, including the guides I did for it. And every time, although I didn't want to main it, I think of a spec that had all these variety of unique spells, from wild mushrooms and their detonations to crazy dot interactions with haste, and just generally being a monster in various scenarios and just being an absolute ton of fun. I haven't had that fun in Legion. That doesn't mean it's not a good spec. It just has some basic problems. So before we get into the goods and the bads, let me talk about exactly what's happening here with the changes from Warlords of Draenor into Legion. The biggest change you're going to notice is, of course, the addition of Astral Power instead of moving between Solar and Lunar Eclipse. Along with that, they've changed the name of some spells. Wrath is now Solar Wrath, and Starfire is now called Lunar Strike and has a little splash damage component to it, making it more AoE friendly, I suppose is the idea they're going for there. So the way Astral Power works is pretty easy. You can talent so your dots give some Astral Power, but generally speaking, most of your Astral Power is going to come from Solar Wrath, Lunar Strike, and your new artifact ability, which is New Moon. So New Moon is really vital and actually gives a really good playstyle change to how the Balanced Druid works and gives you some insight and some forethought into how to maximize your play. Something I'm a huge fan of, so 2 thumbs up. The New Moon spell works like this. It has 3 charges maximum. When your first spell that you will cast is New Moon. Very quick, less than a second, and give you 10 Astral Power. Once you cast that, your Moon spell will then change. It will change into Half Moon. At Half Moon, you will generate twice as much Astral Power. The cast time is doubled, and you will get a little bit more bump for a little bit more damage for your buck. And the last spell that you'll get on the 3rd charge is Full Moon. Full Moon will actually cause a moon to come crashing down out of the fucking sky and then actually detonate and give you 40 Astral Power, giving you an absolutely tremendous boost to what you can actually do with it. So what can you do with Astral Power? Well, you have a choice of 2 spenders. You can either spend it on Star Surge, which will then empower. For every Star Surge will give an empowerment to both Solar Wrath and Lunar Strike for 1 charge, increasing their damage. And if you talent it, it will decrease the cast time and so on and so forth. And every time you Star Surge, that will keep adding empowerments up to a maximum of 3. So if you fire 3 Star Surges back to back, you will have 3 charges of Lunar Strike empowerment and 3 charges of Solar Wrath empowerment. The other spender, of course, is Starfall. Now, you should be aware that Starfall has fundamentally changed. It's no longer an AoE that emanates around you. It's a targeted spell, much like Rain of Fire, Blizzard, and more appropriately, Hurricane. Yes, it's very much a rework of Hurricane. So Starfall has been changed from the iconic stance that it once has into a kind of standard style drop-and-forget AoE that does okay damage. They've allowed room for it to be talented so you can do more damage with it. So that's the basic idea of the Balanced Druid. So let's start with the good then. The rotation, or the priority system, is really varied depending on the scenarios you're going to get. Because of moon charges stacking out at 3, or capping out at 3 I should say, then you want to keep on top of that. If you start letting your charges sit at 3, then obviously you're missing out on potential half moons and full moons. New moon isn't particularly interesting, but then again, that's the way the system works. So you're going to want to manage that, and depending on into every scenario you do, you want to make sure you're doing that, because not managing your moon spells means you're missing out on a tremendous amount of finishes. On top of that, the way the spells work with empowerments means that you have interesting scenarios going on. If you want to do a big nuke, you're going to want to shoot off as many Star Surges as possible. They're one of your hardest hitting spells. Doing so is going to give you 3 stacks of empowerment on each of your spells, and that means you then have to work in firing them off. And what you'll find in many occasions is when you start back-to-backing empowered spells, you'll start gaining a lot of astral power, and that means that you get more finishers, but at the same time you're going to have to manage those moon spells that are constantly recharging and making them work for you as well. This means that there's no real set-in-stone rotation unless you're going to plonk yourself down right in front of a boss like the Butcher or patchwork-style bosses, which are very, very rare these days. And what it does mean, and the great thing, is that balanced druids have a lot of options in how to attack things and how to deal with the amount of astral power which comes up and down depending on your moon spells. Manage that appropriately, and this spec really takes off. It does take off. It goes into a nice place. If you don't manage this appropriately, this spec can feel really, really weak sauce. And the next good thing I really found about it after about 20 hours of play is that the talent system works in your favor. And a lot of them are very heavily based around astral power generation. I'll talk about that in the negatives, but some of the talents are really good. I showed earlier on the Ion Cannon spell, which is Fury of Elune. This gives you an almost Shadow Priest playstyle, for any of you who watched the recent video on that. That allows you to actually manage how much astral power you're generating and new moon spells to drop during Fury of Elune, which will continue the beam to keep shooting into the target and doing tremendous amounts of DPS. Something that should always, I believe, if it's in the hands of a good player or under the effects of super haste buffs where you're generating a lot more astral power through Solar Wrath and Lunar Strike, mean that a better player should always get way more out of this spell than a worse player. And that's something I think we can all be appreciative of. If you work it correctly, you get a nice satisfying spell that looks super fucking cool and works really, really well in terms of your gameplay. The other good thing I noticed about the talents is that if you choose something like Incarnation, which has always been the go-to for a lot of balanced druids, is it's not as simple a choice anymore. Your base DPS cooldown is Celestial Alignment, which is going to give you a flat damage buff and more astral power gain from Solar Wrath and Lunar Strike. If you take Incarnation, you're going to get a longer buff, but it's going to replace Celestial Alignment, so you no longer have Celestial Alignment to go along with it. That means that it's not a clear-cut decision on whether you take Incarnation or not. Now, in most cases, you're probably still going to take Incarnation because it lines up nicely with things like Bloodlust and Burn phases, but Stellar Flare and Soul of the Forest aren't to be easily discounted. Those mean that you still keep Celestial Alignment on top of gaining those spells. A lot of people seem to be missing out on that. They just look at Incarnation as a big DPS cooldown, but forget that while you gain Soul of the Forest, which increases the damage buff of your empowerment spells and reduces the astral power cost of Starfall, and Stellar Flare, which was, is an extra dot, those aren't as easily discounted because you'll still have Celestial Alignment on top of that as a big DPS cooldown. A very nice addition there. Overall, the talent system is okay. I think it's okay and it's fine and it works. And a good thing to take away from what I'm telling you right now is that the balanced druid works. It's reasonably interesting, it keeps things going, and it's always a relatively smooth gameplay experience depending on what you're doing. Dotting is not the end of the world. The nice change to this Sunfire that we've had now for a while works really well, and overall it's okay and it works. So let's go with the negatives, because obviously I started the video with a relatively negative approach to it. Let's talk about the talents going forward. There are far too many talents that are just about astral power generation. I talked earlier that fundamentally at the baseline it feels like this is a broken spec. Now what I mean by that is the astral power system doesn't play nicely with Blizzard's design philosophy in Legion, which is that if you want to do things like AoE, cleave, or single target, you really have to commit to those. So in order to do that, they have to make the talents patch up what is essentially a system that doesn't really work without the talents. Now you might say, well, everyone's going to have the talents. You are correct, but what this means is if you try to do something outside of what you've really specced into and really focused on, it feels really bad. Because the base system just isn't designed to allow you to do it. They don't want you to be able to cast a lot of Starfalls and a lot of Star Surges and mix around and do different things. And that means that in certain scenarios, if you spec full single target and you have to do some AoE, you feel really lackluster and weak. Your Starfall costs way too much, you're not getting all the benefit of being inside Starfall, and therefore you can't use some of the spells that would actually buff that up incredibly. And that's really kind of sad. And I felt that going forward. On that note, I will say that after so many hours of play, I absolutely cannot get over how much I dislike the change to Starfall. It feels so much worse now than it has done ever in the history of the game, and it makes me incredibly sad every time I press it. There is something so iconic, and I don't think many people can disagree that Starfall was a pretty iconic part of the Moonkin toolkit, and now it is just a plop and forget AoE spell. And every time I press it, I don't feel anything other than I'm dropping an AoE spell. It's not as cool. The old Starfall also had some good gameplay elements. Like, I could press it, I know it's going to do its job, while continuing to do the other things like proper multi-dotting and managing all that kind of stuff. And it gave a really nice element to the Moonkin. Now it's very much similar to Blizzard, Hurricane, and of course, Rain of Fire. You just fire it down and then you go back to it, you get the targeting reticule and all that kind of stuff. And it's just nowhere near as fun, nowhere near as interesting. And every time I play it, I'm just like, ugh. This was so much better in the past, and there's no getting away from that. What I did find is that once you get used to it, you just kind of forget about it. And that's the sadness for me. That's where I was kind of disappointed, is that popping Starfall was always kind of fun. You could adjust with it. If the tank moved, it was never a problem. You could work around it. And this time, if the tank does move and you're in a speed running dungeon, you can't do that. And it always pops a little fun. I know some people will say, well, I'm kind of happy now we won't have Starfall ninja pulls. I kind of think that that's something that you can manage as a good player, and also it does give those kind of moments as fun. And similar to Barrage, is when it happens, it kind of happens and it's okay, and it's allowed that the game can do that and also teach that player to manage that spell correct. Starfall was never really a spell that you couldn't cast, as we've had in different scenarios sometimes. The real badness for this, the talents work. I want to say the artifact weapon is some of the most mundane stuff in the entirety of Legion. This is one of the worst artifact weapons I've seen so far. Absolutely everything is outside of your control. The main things you're going for are echoing stars, which is when Starfall deals damage, it deals damage to something else nearby. Okay, I mean, it's an AoE spell, as that's kind of what it does already. I'm not going to notice that. Moon and Stars during Incarnation, Chosen of a Loon. Each harmful spell grants you 1% haste. This is quite nice. However, it's on such a 3-minute timer that if you want to compare it to something like the Shadow Priest, it's not even close. If you compare it to a Shadow Priest that's popping into Void form every 40 seconds or so and staying in there for a majority of the time, and it's entirely based off that, this feels like a really lackluster version of that, regardless of how many times you try it. And it's quite cool, and it does stack up and go really well. Is ultimately it's still a case of other classes just have this better. And then we have Power of Goldrin. Star Surge has a chance to summon the Spirit of Goldrin, which immediately deals 50,000 arcane damage. Okay, I mean, it's not exciting in the least to get up to these. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it at all. But getting there isn't any good. On top of that, all we have is really bizarre. Well, not bizarre, but really mundane stuff. Crit chance of Lunar Strike. Sunfire deals more damage. What I would have loved to have seen here, and we could talk about it as more of a talent than an artifact ability, is if we are going to have this system where we commit to AoE, is I would really love for the Moonfire to be able to spread. If I could talent that as well, and in particular I would enjoy that to Stellar Flare, which then gives us a cast time dot, because Stellar Flare is an extra dot that you get with a 1.24 second cast, where Sunfire and Moonfire naturally spread, and Stellar Flare is something you can cast, and that would make Stellar Flare something that works far better with Stellar Drift. Stellar Drift increases Starfall's radius by 30%, making it the hugest AoE in the game. Starfall damage by 20%, meaning Starfall damage isn't incredibly weak source as it is right now, and it allows you to cast while moving within Starfall's radius. This would add a lot of benefit to me towards Stellar Flare. This would make Stellar Flare way more interesting. I will say they need to change Stellar Flare. Right now it costs 15 Astral Power. Unless you have superior amounts of haste and you can generate a lot of Astral Power, even going with a full sort of AoE spec, you just don't seem to be able to generate, even at 110 when I was testing, the amount of Astral Power needed to keep Starfall on cooldown. It has a base 60 cost as it is. If I wanted to take Stellar Flare, which seems like it would make sense, as part of Stellar Flare's component is that it benefits from being inside Starfall. I should mention here that when you Starfall, your dots do more damage for any target that's inside Starfall, so it seems to me that they want you to use Stellar Flare. I'd rather the tooltip for Stellar Flare change to include Moonfire now spreads, and it now works as it is and does no longer cost Astral Power, but it has a cast time. That means that we have a lot of more dotting capability to go in there rather than tab, single target, tab, 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 as we generally do. That would make the AoE rotation, which is clearly designed for you to be multi-dotting inside of Starfall. That's what they want you to be doing, and the whole system is designed that way. That would make that far more interesting and give Stellar Flare a little bit of weight. Right now, it costs too much, to the point where if you cast 2 of them, you're unlikely to be able to keep Starfall going, and that makes it a little bit on the weak side, if I'm being honest with you. My conclusion for this, for the Moonkin, if you want to choose this going forward into Legion, is this. The real disappointment with the Moonkin is that the changes feel like they're incredibly practical. As I said earlier, everything works. You have a new sort of raid cooldown, you no longer have Stampeding Roar, but you do have Innovate, which ties into some of the legendaries as well, which we're going to be looking at later this week. But everything the Moonkin does, other specs right now do much, much better. It no longer feels iconic and unique. And the Moonkin, for me, for at least the last 3 expansions, has always felt incredibly unique, incredibly fun. It's had these opportunities to really shine. We've seen several bosses where Moonkins have been absolutely awesome. And if they weren't being absolutely awesome, they were just generally being great. Right now, if I wanted to do... I would easily recommend a Shadow Priest or a Elemental Shaman or a Mage over the Moonkin. Because it does nothing better and it doesn't play better than those specs at any of its jobs. While Shadow Priests have lackluster AoE skills, it makes up for it in the Insanity system, which is far more interesting than anything the Moonkin can provide. Even with the Artifact Weapon granting haste and Fury of Elune to be managed, Shadow Priests just have a much better time of doing it because they're designed around that and it's not tacked on as a talent. Similarly, if I wanted to do really kick-ass AoE, I'd probably choose a Fire Mage, or I would choose easily an Elemental Shaman, which has good artifact abilities that you can actually make use of, and they all tie into the AoE, and there's nothing more satisfying than dropping multiple Earthquakes. It's way more satisfying than trying to keep Starfall on cooldown. Right now, it just feels like a very practical, it works. I can't say there will ever be a problem with it particularly, but it's nowhere near as fun, which is, again, it's a subjective thing. Some people will disagree on that, but for me, every other caster I've played, pretty much, besides Hunters, has had a way more interesting system and a way more interesting way of going about things. And that's the real sadness for me. Every time I logged onto the Moonkin and I looked back at my stuff in Warlords of Draenor, where I was super hype every time I played it, I'm not feeling that now. The leveling experience has been mundane. It's nowhere near as fun as some of the great moments we had in Warlords of Draenor, where we were mounted up inside the Grand on the Wolf and running around with Starfall and multi-dotting everything. That is just something that only a Moonkin could do, and it was super cool to have that option and to be able to say, well, I'm a Moonkin and I can do this. You can no longer do that. You can no longer do that, and that's real sad. You can kind of make it work, but nowhere near in the fun as what I had certainly in Warlords of Draenor's leveling experience, where it was like pop Starfall, multi-dotting all over the place, and you just knew that a path of carnage had been left behind by a Moonkin. It just doesn't happen anymore. It's nice to see things like Fury of Force of Nature. I would still prefer it on the charge system that we had previously, where you could fire them off either all 3 or 1 at a time. Now it's just all 3, but they do taunt the targets, and again, it's a very practical decision. It works nicely. It's kind of like having a little temporary hunter pet like marksmans get, but ultimately, this doesn't feel like a Moonkin anymore. I honestly feel, and some people might want to have a discussion on this, this feels very much like around Cataclysm Time Destruction Warlock. Most of the spells feel exactly the same, despite Lunar Strike having its small splash damage component and Solar Wrath being more single target focused. The fact that New Moon and all 3 of its different variations, Solar Wrath and Lunar Strike, all feel like the same spell. They don't feel any different, and that's an array of 5 spells that you'll be casting regularly that just don't feel different in any way. The game kind of tells you when you're empowered, you should be pressing Solar Wrath, and you should be pressing Lunar Strike, and you want to keep your New Moons on. And ultimately, you have 5 different spells here that all feel very much the same. And despite the fact that Moonfire and Sunfire do feel fundamentally different, they've been a base of the Moonkin now for a very, very long time. I would just like to see more. I would just like to see them take some risks with this. I don't understand why Eclipse was so easily given up on. And maybe that's the wrong thing to say, as they've tried to make Eclipse work. But despite the fact that the Moonkin is so stupid, and it is stupid, you play a giant chicken. Let's be honest here. This is a really silly spec. It's a really silly spec to go into. You play a giant chicken that can pull the moon out of the fucking sky. It's ridiculous. But the gameplay is not ridiculous. It isn't ridiculous at all, and it doesn't have those moments of ridiculousness that the Moonkin is kind of known for at this point. It's just works. It's nice. It's smooth gameplay, and yeah, I can get behind it, and it all kind of makes sense, and I can maximize some gameplay, which is all really nice, but where's the really fun component of it? Is any of this really fun? Not really. Not really. From a facts and figures, it works just fine. But where's the silliness? I play a giant fucking chicken that tears the moon out of the goddamn sky. Could I call down a sun? Can I do something? Can I fire off bats when I'm in, like, Luna? Can I fire off owls when I'm in, you know, or something along those lines? Can we get some silliness in here? And you might say you call down an ion cannon. That's true, and that's absolutely great, and the fact that you can move the ion cannon is tremendous, but will that see much use? No. It's a really fancy graphic for something that is just about spamming Astral Power, rather than just being fundamentally silly. And silliness, like, I mean, this is the class that had Flappy. Okay? And you could flap like a chicken and flow through the sky. That's what I think of when I think of my Moonkin. I think most people think of that when they think of their Moonkin. It's a very silly spec. I want it to work, I want it to do its damage, but I also want it to be somewhat ridiculous. Because that's what I'm known for. That's why I play this giant fat chicken that does a ridiculous chicken dance. I feel like Blizzard has forgot that in the name of balance. And not to make a pun there, because it's the balance druid. In the name of balance and making sure that it all practically works together. And it just feels to me like the silliness that this spec should have, and I do believe it should have that because of the sheer nature of the spec, is lost at the moment. And if I want to do the practicality side of things, which is doing good AoE, good single target, frankly, other specs just do it better and in a more fun way. That's my conclusion on it. Right now, it works just fine. It'll probably go live this way and it's cool, but it's definitely lost a little bit of its soul for me. And the last 20 hours or so I've been playing it, I've been waiting for them to do some changes to it, and it's just not happened. This is what they're going with, and there you go. That's my finale on that one. All right, thank you for listening, guys. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.